Okay, everyone, welcome to Human Resources 215. We are here for chat number 3 in our series, which means we are headed towards and kind of at the halfway point. We're kind of to the getting over the hump of our class here, in going into week 3. So we have a lot to talk about today related to compensation and benefits. But first, wanted to just kind of talk through uh, briefly what's on deck for today. Certainly some highlights from our course resources and talking through comp and benefits as it relates to prepping you for working through your Unit 3 in telepath unit. Um, but I wanted to take just a couple minutes and, based on questions I've been receiving and based on uh, the work that I see you guys doing in telepath or not doing for some of you, um, I really just wanted to kind of take this opportunity to check in with you. We're kind of at this midpoint, and this is this is your chance. This is your chance to whether get back on track or whatever it is you need to do to make sure you're successful in this course. If you've been on track to this point and are doing well, just don't let it slack off. Hi, Mary. Thanks for joining me. I'm just getting going and I'm just kind of talking through where everybody's at. And so this isn't necessarily directed towards you, but I just wanted to kind of check in with everybody because I know a lot of people review this archive as well. And then and let you guys know that we're kind of at the halfway point of our course. And uh, so what I'm going to be doing in addition to, reviewing your unit 2 and 3 and telepath and everything like that is I'm going to be kind of checking in with you guys, especially those of you that maybe, um, because I can see what units you've worked on or haven't worked on in telepath, or if you've maybe been away from class for a few days or something like that. And before the system starts to send you those like last day attended alerts and things like that, if it's been a few days, because I get those alerts about you as well. I just want to make sure that number one, all of you are staying active in class, which even if you've been very active to this point, or I know some of you have gotten even a little bit ahead, which is totally fine to be working through these IntelliPath units at your own pace. But just remember, um, the general guideline is, and the expectation from CTU is to log in and do some work within every 72 hours. So that's with like one time every 3 days. So just because I don't want to see anything, like I don't want to see somebody accidentally get dropped from the course or something like that. Now that being said, there are some of you that are working kind of on pace with the class. There are some of you that maybe have fallen a little bit behind, and there are some of you that are working a little ahead. Everything's fine. Again, we're at that midpoint, and there should be no reason um, why you guys don't pass this course. Even if you've gotten off track, as of right now, you have the time. But you do have to decide, between now and when our class wraps up, when you have time to work on it and commit to that. Because you're getting to a point where it'll start to seem overwhelming, especially if you've got another class and you've got projects due and things like that. Sometimes in telepath, because it's kind of at your own pace, it can be something that's easier to set to the side or, oh, yeah, I'll get to that or whatever. And trust me, you will not achieve the grade that you are capable of if you try and do all the work for this class, the last week or so of class. Um, I don't want to see you guys just pass. I mean, this is this is a this is a base class. This is not even something in most of your majors, but it's great information for you to take with you into your careers, into your fields, whether you become a manager, whether you have to partner with human resources, whether you own a small business and need to kind of wear the HR hat in some respects. There may be parts of, some of the laws that we talk about that don't apply because maybe you work for a smaller organization or something like that. But it's good to know and good to have an understanding, whether it's even just you as an employee of all of this kind of stuff. And so that's why we're kind of taking it um, and breaking it down each week and covering different areas of HR and kind of, the operational aspect of HR. Last week we talked about recruitment and selection, which is really the most visible part of HR. But as we get into compensation and benefits and training and development, these are areas that sometimes are a little bit more behind the scenes, but are really key to uh, the efficient operations of an organization. So, like I said, um, I'm here to help you succeed. So, if you're having problems working through the IntelliPath, you might see that I've already started assigning some different suggestions as to where you can do additional practices and revisions on Unit 1 and even in Unit 2 as you're working through it. Our Unit 2 is due tomorrow, and so you'll see the grades get posted in the grade book on Thursday, but those will continue to be revised as we continue to work through our course. So even though you may move ahead into Unit 3 and beyond, you can always go back. So make sure that you're working and doing the work for that week. So you're giving yourself time at the end of class to go through at the end and do additional practices and revisions to earn more of the points possible in the class. Okay. So that being said, hold on just one sec. I got a cough. Sorry. Today we're going to be talking through employee compensation. And um, as we think about compensation and benefits structures and what they look like within organizations, uh, the most obvious thing is direct financial payments, like our wages, our salaries, things like that. Uh, and we're all very aware if something is, awry with, us getting paid, right? But it also can include things like incentives, commissions, bonuses, depending on the type of job you work in and the type of environment, things like that. But it also includes indirect payment. So things like if you're in a position where your employer has health insurance, right? They kick in for part of it and you kick in for part of it. Well, an indirect payment is the part that they pay because they're absorbing that cost on your behalf. If you're in a full-time position where you're accruing vacation time or you get paid jury duty leave or paid sick time or something like that. Those are all uh, benefits and they're indirect payments because those are things that the employer is paying when you're not physically on the job working. So there's a number of laws that have come into effect, some a number of years ago, some more recently, and a lot of them have been amended over the years and added to, as well as things in our country have changed and different things have been necessary to clarify within the laws and within the acts. And there are some that apply to different size employers, and there are some that apply to majority of all of us working in the US workforce. The first one, and we touched on a couple of these last week because some of these do also um, relate to recruitment and selection as well. I'm just taking an initial screenshot of attendance here. I know sometimes we have some folks join us late too. But the first one I wanted to talk about is the Fair Labor Standards Act. The acronym for that is the FLSA. This is one that has been um, in action for, gosh, close to 100 years now. It was initially passed back in the 30s, 1930s, and this is a biggie. It created the initial minimum wage laws, maximum hours, and overtime pay provisions. So, like for those of you that work in an hourly position and you get paid overtime when you work at least 40 hours, or for some of you at least 36 hours, that's where this came into play. Um, there was a time in our country, especially during the industrialization era, where people worked really just a ridiculous amount of hours and got paid um, well, I mean, it sounds like pennies on the dollar now. I mean, it was, a different time, but get paid unfairly because they would work like 80-hour work weeks and not get paid um, for the time and sometimes the health. and the lack of sleep and things like that that they were sacrificing to be able to work. Now, sometimes it was necessary to work those hours, but at least the Fair Labor Standards Act enacted some provisions so that American workers were being paid more fairly. It also created child labor provisions. And again, this law covers the majority of U.S. workers. So again, the industrialization era was a time of a lot of child labor, a lot of kids didn't finish, didn't go beyond even grade school education and dropped out to work and help, earn income for their families. And thanks, Fayan. Thanks for joining us. Uh, so this enacted, if any of you had jobs or have kids with jobs now, when you were a teenager, those laws that say you can only work a certain amount of hours on a school day, or can't work past a certain time on a school day, or can't work in excess of a certain amount of hours in a week that is a school week. That's where these provisions came from as well. So it was really the first act that was to protect American workers, one of the first ones. The Equal Pay Act came around a number of years later in the 60s and talked about the differences in pay between men and women. The specific language of the act talks about the employees of one sex cannot be paid wages at a rate lower than paid to employees of the opposite sex for doing roughly equivalent work. And unfortunately, even in today's day and age, although this act has helped in the workplace, it's still not equal, especially in some jobs that were traditionally more male dominated positions, although it does protect both ways. So if it's a more female dominated position, that males get paid equally as well. What mostly this act was created for was to increase and equal women's pay in the workplace for doing the same jobs as men. And uh, this evolved out of purely discriminatory practices. Um, but like I said, even in today, in 2019, there are many positions that women are only being paid, and this is, on average statistic, but 70 to 75 cents on the dollar for doing the same job. Now, when an employer identifies that that is happening or has happened, they should be doing something to rectify it. But it isn't always brought to their attention, or it isn't always discovered. Sometimes it can evolve out of outdated practices. I had a female firefighter in class a couple years ago that, female firefighters have been allowed on the workforce in many areas from a anti-discriminatory practice for many years. But uh, even though the Equal Pay Act was in place, um, the job descriptions may have been written as such that there was an assumption that the female could not do the same level of physical work as the males. And so then the males in that job were paid more. Uh, what what my female firefighter shared with me is, at least in her jurisdiction, what they did is they revised the job description so it included a physical standards like testing process and recertification process. And so, males and females are required to do the same physical labor, same physical tests and everything to be evaluated and to be hired into the job, and therefore are paid within the same pay ranges. So equal pay, right? Equal pay for equal work. There are still jobs out there, companies out there, and again, some of it is not intentional, that are paying people of different sex different wages for doing the same work. But when it is discovered, because this act is in place, they should be doing something to rectify it. Because what can happen is, it may not sound like a lot for somebody to be earning 25 cents less an hour or whatever, but of the hours, of the weeks, of the years of employment, that not only can that disparity become greater and greater because they started out at a lesser rate of pay, uh, but um, but it adds up, right? So that could equal certainly thousands of dollars, in some cases millions or upwards of the excess of $1 million or more, depending, if that female makes it to, an executive level position and is still being, not paid fairly for the work that she's doing because she started out at a lower rate of pay earlier in her career. Now, the flip side of this is women, and I mean, we have, kind of an equal amount of women and men in our class, so this isn't meant to be anything against men, but women traditionally, and, this is, kind of our own fault, ladies, but we traditionally kind of undervalue ourselves in the workplace. And so we have to be aware of that as well, and making sure that we feel we are being compensated fairly for the work and for the work we're doing and the experience we bring to a job. So just food for thought. Some other important acts and laws. Diane, I saw that you had a question. I'm just going to give her a second here because I see she's typing. So before we move on. Oop, is my microphone off? No, it is. Okay, that's fine. Ah, yeah, yeah. So that's an important note too. So, a lot of these laws um, apply in the recruitment and selection process as well. So that's an interesting point, Diane. Um, whether it's part of the interview process or even um, as part of employment. Yeah, yeah, and that can be from a sexism standpoint. It can be from an age discrimination standpoint. It can be from a disability standpoint. Um, yeah, and there are protections and the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that can help out. If she does feel that she was uh, discriminated against or something like that too. Yeah. Well, yeah, and she actually managed to advance, but like at what cost, right? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I've worked in a couple um work environments, manufacturing and finance that were traditionally male dominated fields, and it's funny. I mean, not not joke funny, but it's crazy to observe um, when and sometimes it's not even intentional, but when stuff like that is still in 2019 happening in the workplace, right? Whether somebody is um, being kind of given unfair advantages um, because of their sex or something like that. Yeah. Well, and an important thing to remember as we're talking about these laws, and it relates to these kind of laws, but it also relates to things like harassment in the workplace. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind, whether for all of you and me, like as employees, or even acting as a manager, acting as a representative of the company, um, is in the eyes of the law. It what lawyers will argue, and this is kind of how it's viewed, is it doesn't matter the intent of the person or the company. It matters the perception of the person that was impacted. So like in a potential harassment case, is that person maybe didn't intend to be offensive, but the person perceived it as offensive to them. Or maybe a manager didn't attempt to discriminate against somebody with a disability or discriminate against a woman or whatever, but that person felt they were discriminated against and were acted un, you know unfairly. They acted unfairly towards them. Yeah. So, in the eyes of the law, it's important to kind of remember that perspective because for those of us, including me, that have not gone to law school, I've just studied a lot of these laws as they relate to, um, HR and the employment process. Um, that's, kind of that main perspective to remember. Interesting though. Yeah, it is amazing and sometimes bewildering to me to when I've witnessed that in the workplace. And I've fortunately been in a position um, in the past within corporations where, um, in a respectful way, I could kind of discuss that with a senior leader or with that leader, of, have you considered how this might be perceived? Your actions and your actions as a leader. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So, in addition to the Equal Pay Act, we've got Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, another one that's been around for a long time, about 70 years or so. And this is the one, so from a employment aspect, from a recruitment aspect, this is the one that we see in some way, shape, or form, usually as a blurb somewhere on the online application process that says, like we as a company, we as an employer do not discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. How this plays out in the workplace is, similar to the Equal Pay Act with sex being the main focus. Sex is included in this one too, but it also is obviously more encompassing. So, um, sorry, I'm just doing another quick attendance because I saw a couple more people hopped on. Uh, Title VII in the workplace, obviously, um, again, it's something um, part that the EOC and the National Labor Relations Board help to establish and govern, um, because this has implications with hiring, compensation, and even terms or conditions of employment. Um, Now, different acts that have uh, kind of not necessarily singled out, but um, addressed different areas of this are the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the ADEA, which protects employees older than 40 years of age. Now, I know we've got folks in our class that are over 40 years of age, and you may not even heard of this law before, or you may not think you kind of think, well, 40 doesn't sound very old. But where that number came from and why 40 years of age is part of that law is it really came about when there were periods in our country's history where there were um, big reductions in force due to economic circumstances and things like that. And as companies do have the right to certainly right size their workforce for the for whether it's a production capability standpoint or whatever their workload demands. But in doing that, one of the things that the Age Discrimination in Employment Act says is they have to consider if they are adversely impacting those of a certain age group. So, um, what an analyzation of a good amount of data showed was that when companies do a reduction in force, they were eliminating jobs of people that had been with the organization a number of years, right? So obviously, if you have a lot of seniority, you're probably older. And so it may not have been intentional. In some cases, it may have been because they said, oh, well, we pay those people more, so it'll save us more money by getting rid of them. Um, you know, assuming assuming the best, maybe that wasn't the intention, but it still happened, right? And so that's what this act is designed to help protect. So, like I said, it doesn't mean that an employer can't do a reduction in force, but they do have to analyze the impact to their workforce and making sure that uh, it is indeed from a uh, needs of the business standpoint and not adversely impacting the group that is protected under that law. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, provides similar protections, but for those with disabilities as defined by the Act. Now, this is another one it covers as part of recruitment, as part of employment, and it includes compensation too. So if somebody can do the job, disability or not, they should be paid the same, right? So, aspects of these laws all kind of say, like, no matter what your thing is, whether you're, a man or a woman, whether you're a different religion, whether you have a disability or not, whether you're over 40 or not. So there's different aspects, but protecting that same thing of they shouldn't discriminate you based on X, right? Now, but what the Americans with Disabilities Act also affords is a reasonable accommodation. And the commitment on both the employer's part and the employee or potential employee's part to um, engage in what's called an iterative process. So basically, it means a back and forth discussion as to what that reasonable accommodation might be. Uh, as an example, a labor attorney friend of mine um, uh, gave a great example, and to those of you, so it was around somebody that had irritable bowel syndrome. And for those of you that either have or are familiar with IBS, it's not it's a difficult condition to live with. In short story, just you may need to utilize a bathroom frequently. And so this isn't meant to disparage anybody if you happen to have that condition. It's just a great example of how this might play out in the workplace. So this person developed this condition as an employee, and so engaged with a conversation with her boss of, can I, I need to be located near a restroom. And so the reasonable accommodation that they came up with together was that she could switch with somebody and have the whatever cube or office or whatever that was closest to the bathroom. So that way she would be close to it in case she needed it. Now that by the employer was deemed a reasonable accommodation, right? Reasonable kind of being like not a significant added expense, didn't, displace other employees. It was relatively easy, it was like, switching one person, that kind of thing. And the employee was amenable to it, meaning that they agreed to it as well. What might be an unreasonable accommodation to an employer is for an employee to ask them to build them a bathroom near their office, or to build a bathroom in their office, right? Because that could be a significant added expense. It's not the typical layout or amenities provided to other employees. A number of things that could be. Now, depending on the employer, that may not be a big deal either. Maybe it's a small employer and they can redo the office floor plan and add a bathroom. Who knows? But in this case, they were able to fairly easily have that conversation, come up with a reasonable accommodation that worked for both parties, and proceed with that. Another thing that's covered with the Americans with Disabilities Act is pregnancy. So, um, not only while employed, but even as part of the interview process. So, you are interviewing for a job, you can be visibly pregnant, and um, the employer legally cannot ask you if you're pregnant. Now, they can ask you, per the job description, are you capable of performing the duties of the job? But again, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that could be with a reasonable accommodation. Now, with a pregnancy, I mean, that could be something as simple as if it's a job where you're on your feet a lot, being able to sit a reasonable amount of the day or having access to a chair. It could be uh, um, being able to do the job just fine, but uh, accommodating you, needing to leave for doctor's appointments or whatever. So pregnancy is a covered condition, even though it is a temporary one, because eventually you're going to have that baby, right? So just an interesting kind of fact about it. Uh, Another interesting act, and it's kind of related to the pregnancy one, just because that's when a lot of people tend to take FMLA, is the Family and Medical Leave Act. So this was originally passed back in 1993, and it allows for, and not just women, men as well, to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid job protected leave. And that can be for the birth of a child, also to care for a child or a spouse or a parent. So, um, interestingly, um, a lot of companies since then, especially in recent years, due to competition and trying to recruit better employees, not better employees, but great employees, um, a lot of companies, especially bigger companies, have also been kind of adding to this and offering um, some type of paid leave. Some states have even been, I think New York was the most recent one to pass it, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it's not 12 weeks. I think it's like a 2-week paid leave, but at least then you're getting paid during that time off, because what the one thing that the FMLA doesn't cover is pay. So even though you can take up to 12 weeks, I don't know about you guys, but there's very few people I know that can be 12 weeks off from a job unpaid, right? I mean, especially those of us that are maybe single parents or something like that. Um, you got to have some income coming in so you can pay the bills. Now you might be separately, depending, if you're off going off for a surgery or maybe for the birth of a child, there might be another plan, depending on your employer, like a short-term disability plan or something like that. When we, kind of get into benefits that you are covered under, and that may at least give you, kind of a partial benefits payment, or not benefits, pay. If you ever see those commercials on TV, for like Aflac and things like that, those are kind of those supplemental and disability type things that kick in. But they are not stipulations of the FMLA. So um, that's why the provisions say up to 12 weeks, because sometimes people can't take that whole amount of time, or sometimes they don't want to, right? Um, people may be having a knee surgery or something like that, and you may just need to take a couple weeks off, but you want to make sure that your job is protected. So that is the main thing that it does protect, is that you can come back to, um, uh, if not your specific position, an equal position with equal pay, equal benefits, the same schedule, that kind of stuff. Um, so it protects your job while you care for whatever you need to care for, whether it's a child, a spouse, even self. So, uh, and the interesting thing too with this leave is it doesn't have to be taken consecutively. It can be taken intermittently too. So, an example, I had a coworker a number of years ago that unfortunately was going through cancer herself. And while her chemo treatments were, well, if any of you have had friends or family go through chemo, chemo's brutal on your body. But I guess luckily, the type that she was going through, she was strong enough that she could continue working. But when she actually had to go for the treatments, she needed to be off work that day, and then usually a couple days afterward, because she was always really tired and stuff like that. and sick while the medicine kind of does its thing. Um, so she would have, I think it was like every few weeks, she would have a treatment every couple weeks or whatever. So what she had approved was intermittent leave. So she would come to work and work for a few days, and then she would be off for a treatment and couple days following it. Um, another um, person might have, some type of intermittent leave because they have an ongoing like chronic condition that they need to care for. So there's certainly lots of different ways to apply this, but there's also, especially specifically around the FMLA, there's a lot of considerations as to who qualifies and how you qualify. So you have to have worked for your employer for a certain amount of time, duration, and hours. And then there's a number of, like employers have to have at least 50 employees and things like that. So there's a number of stipulations, kind of hurdles that you have to, um, or things that you have to satisfy to be eligible for the Family Medical Leave Act. But it's a great thing to take advantage of when and if you do need it. And from the employer aspect, as a manager or as HR, um, it falls on them to make sure that the employee is filling out the correct paperwork and seeking the approval for whatever type of leave that they'll need to be away from their job for. So um, we're going to talk about unions in a couple weeks when we talk more about employee relations and labor relations specifically. Labor relations is the the organization and the collective bargaining process and around unions and things like that. But I wanted to mention the National Labor Relations Act that was passed in 1935 initially. And while unions existed before this time, there was nothing from a law perspective that required employers to recognize them. So this was really, when this was passed in 1935, this really gave employees rights. It gave them the right to elect a union, to bargain collectively on their behalf, to negotiate not only for wages and benefits and other things that are part of uh, collective bargaining, and that's why it plays into our compensation unit this week, but also their collective rights around safety and things like that. And just like a lot of the labor laws, not only the ones we've been talking about today, but additional ones have been passed over the years to um, protect employees in that way. There are also things around safety and things like that that didn't exist at this time that have been since passed. But at this time, and this is why the unions became so strong at this time in our country's history, uh, because they uh, they bargained sometimes on mandatory aspects, but on a lot of other aspects that really protected employees in a way that they never were before. So, and in addition to the National Labor Relations Act, it actually established the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, which monitored all of this and really kind of presided over it and continues to today. Um, Union strength has waned in our country. Union membership has waned in our country, but there are definitely aspects to it, which we'll get into in a couple weeks, um, which continue to really afford some benefits to employees that that work under collective bargaining contracts. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes, a little more than 15 minutes left here. Um, I wanted to take some time, one more attendance there, to talk about compensation from a policy standpoint. So this impacts all of us, and it's important to think about from all aspects, whether from an employer standpoint, but even as an employee. So, and I've seen this play out. Actually, this hospital scenario it played out in the healthcare system that I worked at, but in a way that you might not think about, which is important for you to consider as you are potentially applying to jobs in the future. So, from a compensation policy perspective, most organizations look at prevailing market wages. And the way that they get that info is a lot of uh, organizations in all different aspects of employment, all different um, types of employers, manufacturing, hospitals, all kinds of stuff. Um, what will happen is a third party, um, an unbiased, uninvolved party, will collect pay data from all of, like, let's say, the hospitals in the area. And then what they'll say is, okay, hospitals in this area, and they'll average them together, are paying nurses between this and this. So then the median pay range is their pay rate is this, right? So then you have kind of a minimum, a maximum, and a midpoint of what is common practice in the area without naming specific, in this case, hospitals. It could be manufacturers, it could be um, uh, retail organizations, whatever. And that's because wages vary in different locations. But then within that different company, they may also have different policies around how they want to recruit or how they want to attract people to the organization. So in this example here, I worked for, it was a great hospital system, but we had a lot of competition. Most of you probably have at least a couple hospital systems in your area, especially maybe probably more if you live in an urban or suburban area. But there's usually at least a couple. One of them might be a little bit further ride for you or something like that, but there's usually at least a couple providers that you can choose from in the area. Um, Now, because of that, because of that competition, they compete for the same employees, right? The same, if it's going to be, 20 minutes to drive to one place versus another, then an employee is going to, or a potential employee is going to look at, okay, well, what are they offering me? And a big part of that is pay. Well, a hospital that was literally up the street from us, like due west, same road, just a few miles up the road, their policy was to pay 20% more than the prevailing market wage. So when you look at that midpoint that we just talked about, they paid about 20% more, which in a nurse's salary was somewhere around maybe 75 cents to a dollar more per hour. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up, right? And for a a lesser, like an hourly job, like a housekeeper or nurse assistant, it might only be a quarter more an hour. But again, when you're working a 40-hour work week, that adds up quickly. Uh, so I was the nurse recruiter at the time at my facility, and at the time I would get nurses come in my office and say, hey, I really love working here, but they're going to pay me more up the road. I gotta go, I gotta do what's best for me and my family. And I said, I understand, but just make sure that, and this is something I recommend, to my students that I work with. It's something that I recommend, when I'm coaching people and through, preparing them for interviews and things like that, um, is make sure you're looking at the total package, apples to apples. And what I mean by that is it's not just the pay, right? Because that employer, although their pay was more, um, their hourly rate of pay was more. Couldn't argue with that, right? When you look at their benefits package, they charged more for, like, the employee portion, like the portion that you and I pay out of our paycheck, right? It was more for single coverage, but it was a lot more for family coverage. And a lot of us, cover our family or cover our kids, right? I mean, makes sense. But even if you weren't, it was still more than even if you were just covering yourself. So benefits usually kick in, after a pay period or two, and then they would come back to my office and they would say, "Oh, now that I'm looking at the bottom line, my take-home pay is actually less because I'm paying more for my benefits. So I'm paying more for my benefits than is offsetting it with the additional pay that I'm earning." Right? They didn't compare apples to apples. And so that's something that I would definitely recommend and challenge you to do is make sure when you are at the point of getting a job offer. I mean, most of us are so excited, about the job offer. A lot of times it's more pay than we're getting currently, whatever. But look at it not just from that standpoint, but what additional things do they offer? Maybe it's a thing of that, your commute is less, and so that is something that you value, or maybe from a flexibility standpoint, it works better with your family's schedule. Those are all things that, we have that provide individual value for us, and so you can't really put a monetary amount on it, but it could be something that is valuable to you. Um, I mean, I remember earlier in my career, I made a move that it was like lateral as far as pay, but it cut more my commute more than in half. So, I mean, from the standpoint, um, I mean, even just when you factor in gas money, right? I mean, that was actually then I was making more money, but just the time perspective, right? And that was before I had kids. I mean, now it would be a no-brainer, right? Of course, I want more time. Everybody wants more time. Um, but anyway, so make sure you're looking apples to apples. The other thing with kind of making sure, like from an apples to apples comparison, is I know a couple of you at least mentioned in your discussion board post that you either recently have relocated or were considering relocating, either as you get closer to finishing your degree or as your kids are finishing high school and what you considering living in a different area or whatever, is as you're applying to jobs you have to factor in cost of living. So it might sound like a certain job pays a lot more, but it could also be that it's a lot more expensive area to live in. As an example, uh, base pay for an executive secretary, like an administrative assistant position, in places like New Mexico or like Tampa, Florida, which have a lower or average cost of living start around $40,000. But if you factor in, and these figures are a couple years old, so if you factor in um, places like New York or San Francisco, some of the most expensive places to live in our country, um, those same jobs, just as a starting salary, the median when I pulled the figures was 60. It's probably with how much cost of living has increased, especially in San Francisco, it's probably at least 80. So it's probably at least double what the base pay is for that type of role. But if you think about it, if you guys have ever, for those of you that do live closer to urban areas, you may know this firsthand, or if you've ever even visited New York. I went to New York last summer um, for a few days as a little vacation. And I mean, everything is more expensive there. It's more expensive to get around. It's more expensive. The dinners are more expensive. Everything. Um, I met I met one of my friends that works in the city for coffee, and she lives outside the city but commutes in, and her train fare each month is more than a car payment. Um, every month, right? And it's not, I mean it's just that's not even to own a car. It's just to ride the train, right? So the cost to live and work in those cities is a lot more. Oh, that's okay, Kristen. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so we're just talking about compensation from a standpoint of factoring in everything that plays into it, whether it's cost of living, recruitment policies, things like that. So lots of interesting things to look at, whether it's you that's applying to a new job, because we're all going to be, doing that at some point, whether it's in the near future or sometime down the road. But also if you are in a management position. So looking at your company's policies and flexibility, and also some things we're going to talk about in a sec here around um, uh, equity and getting people in at a fair wage and rate of pay. So when we talk about equity, and I know we've only got about 5, 6 minutes left here. So I want to touch on a couple things. So equity, there's kind of two areas that employers need to look at in regards to equity. Internal equity, making sure that people with the same amount of experience are being paid the same for doing the same job. So earlier we talked about different laws that protect, different sexes and things like that. And this is just saying that everything should be equitable, right? Um, Now that doesn't mean it should be equal. If you've got 5 years experience and somebody else has, 0 or 1, in theory, if a company has a pay range, you should be higher in that pay range because you're bringing more experience to the position. Um, but in considering that pay range, uh, you may have a situation in a company that you are recruiting to fill an opening. So you're recruiting somebody from outside the company, and um, you have to make sure that you're in referring back to those that market data that companies collect, is you have to make sure that you pay equitable to what people in the marketplace are expecting. Like, what are they making at other companies, and pay them um, with rates that are, at least in the ballpark. Otherwise, you won't be able to attract and retain great employees, right? So there's lots of different ways that employers establish pay rates. Sometimes committees are involved, certainly HR is involved, managers, things like that. And the main thing to take away from this goes back to when we were talking about job analysis and job descriptions, because whether it's a committee, whether it's HR, whatever, is they're determining the worth of each job based on the duties and expectations of that job and what's required of the people coming in and doing that job. Like what experience, what certifications, what training, what education, whatever. And they develop their pay rate ranges based on that. So far we've been talking more about um, like hourly type of positions or professional salaried type of positions. But we also have to think about executive level pay. And executive level pay can certainly vary. And there's a number of factors that go into that. Um, Part of it is job complexity. There's a number of kind of non-quantifiable factors, factors that don't necessarily equate to like, okay, this means we should pay them this, around judgment and problem solving and operational strategy, ability to direct in the company, um, and things like that, especially as you get into senior level and even C-suite management. But part of it is ability to pay as well. If you're talking about a for-profit company, you may hear of executives, making into the millions of dollars. And part of that is because of the profit of the company and that they are able to pay their executives that. Now, that doesn't mean that working for a nonprofit company is any less important or any less um, valuable, but the nonprofit organization may not just simply have the ability to pay you, in excess of whatever, um, from a compensation perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that you might not derive more personal value and personal satisfaction from the job too. So something to consider. So when we talk about it could be managerial, it could be professional level jobs. There's a number of things that kind of go in. We've been talking more about uh, base salary and benefits and things like that. But in addition, the person performing these roles might be eligible for short-term incentives. Could be cash, could be stock options, could be for achieving a short-term goal. You often see we often see these when involved with like sales type of positions. Yeah, Kristen, I think that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, it can look bad for a top executive to make a hefty salary in a nonprofit. Yeah, there was an article I read recently, and I don't remember the name of the organization that was called out, but it is that their senior, well, and it's funny because it's not all their senior people, but like their CEO does take like a hefty portion, and so you wonder like if you're making a donation or something to that organization, like how much is going to that person's salary versus actually helping the people that nonprofit is trying to serve. Yeah. And I think that's something that those type of companies definitely try and keep in perspective because, even when they are trying to fundraise, they often have to disclose that information, right? Whereas a private company might not have to disclose it, right? We hear about it sometimes when in the news when you hear about some kind of like golden parachute that a person had when they were leaving an organization. Yeah, for sure. Other incentives that may play out are longer term. So executives might be offered, like a stock option or something like that if the company is performing well, or different things depending on the nature of the business too. I mentioned to you guys that I live here in the Detroit area, so we've got obviously a lot of the automotive companies based here. So you might have, an executive that has a benefit of a company car, or even an hourly level associate, they have a special um, like discount plan, so they can purchase cars at a significant discount, uh, like a more significant discount than is available to the public, because they help produce those cars, right? They help make them or design them or whatever. So there's a lot of information on this current trends in compensation slide. I'll send this whole PDF to you via email to everybody. But the one thing that I wanted to talk through, because we've already kind of touched on a lot of this, the traditional pay structures and pay ranges and things like that, and market pricing. But one concept that I wanted to hit on before we wrap up is this concept of broadbanding, because it'll play into what we talk about next week in organizational development and training. So because it really provides a lot of flexibility. So it's an approach where companies kind of collapse a lot of the salary grades and ranges into a few wider levels, hence the term broadband. Um, and this really enables employees to do a lot of cross training and maybe working side by side with other groups in different projects or things like that, or getting involved with different aspects of the business without having to actually take a different job or a different pay. Um, so it really encourages cross development and cross training and personal development for employees as well. So just a couple things around incentives before we wrap up for today. Um, Other incentives, uh, we talked more about from a salaried perspective, and people like salespeople and that kind of stuff. But they can also be provided, or they can also be part of a compensation plan uh, for, like, let's say like an hourly line worker in a manufacturing or an environment that could be tied to their performance standards, like how many pieces that they're producing on the line, or not just productivity but also quality, right? So producing X number of products that are with zero defects or things like that, and they could receive a monetary or some other type of reward for achieving those goals. And that could be on an individual or a team-based perspective. And there's certainly advantages and disadvantages to that too. Um, in that, if it's a team perspective, those individual workers, if they don't feel that the whole team is kind of pulling their weight, it can actually be um, a de-incentivizer. And we talked about kind of all these different, could be employee stock ownership, profit sharing. That's something that a lot of for-profit companies see, and it's not just at the executive levels; it's down to the hourly line levels. That that the employees might see a percentage of those profits in their check, and whether it's like on a quarterly basis and on an annual basis, whatever the company determines, um, it's it's one way, it's one perspective that that employers reward employees from that perspective. Oh, one other thing that I wanted to share. Where did that video go? Oh, there it is. I'm gonna cut and paste a YouTube video. It's just a brief thing here, and you can access it. I'm putting it in our chat so you can access it. Um, as we wrap up for today, it's just kind of a comp and benefits overview type of thing that uh, that I found on the internet. I think it's a great kind of summary of a lot of what we touched on. It's like 7 or 8 minutes long, so you can watch it really quick. I would definitely suggest that you check that out. There's also some great resources in our course guide this week, so definitely check those out before you tackle IntelliPath. We do have our second IntelliPath unit due tomorrow, and you'll see the initial grades get posted for those on Thursday. As I mentioned earlier, get going, stay on track with your IntelliPath. Please reach out, um, whether during office hours, via email, messenger, if there's anything that I can help with, or if you've gotten off track and you want to make a plan together. I really want to see you guys be successful in this course. So I will see you guys again next Tuesday. Please have a great rest of your week, and thank you for all your hard work. Thanks. You too, Mary.